Okay, welcome everybody to the session on metadata integrity. I'm Jason Pickering. Uh, my colleague Oleg Polpe, we're both part of the global implementation team from HIP Center, University of Oslo. And we're going to talk today about metadata integrity, what it is, why it's important, what we've done to improve the process, show you some approaches of how to improve it. Um, we're also going to hear from our colleague Barnabas in Abuja. He was not able to join us today due to various issues, but he's also going to give some country perspective um, based on some work that we did recently in Nigeria. Olav's going to start telling you why we care about this. I will then talk about the new and improved metadata integrity API and apps. We'll talk a little bit about tools that we've built to solve some of these problems. And then we'll open it up for questions that you guys might have. Over to you, Olaf.
Thanks. I hope everything now is unmuted and correct. So let's see if I'm able to open the right slide deck. So I think Jason already gave you a bit of an overview of the session and what we're planning. So I'll just get started. So why do we care about the metadata quality and integrity? I mean, it's because everything in DHIS is based on this metadata. So everything we do relies on our metadata being properly configured for the data entry, for the analysis, for doing integrations, for the maintenance of the system. What we're working with all the time is the metadata. And I think there are lots of examples of things that can go wrong with our metadata. Some that can sort of bring the system down or make the system not function. Famous example being having multiple default category options in your system can lead to all sorts of weird issues, for example. You might have issues with the GIS setup, creating all sorts of issues with upgrades, for example. You might have groups and group sets that you set up incorrectly, leading to the wrong outputs in analytics. So you're actually looking at the wrong numbers. There can be issues, for example, another famous issue with the option set sort order, leading to tracker data entry forms not working properly. So that's sort of one set of issues that just makes DHIS not function properly. Then there are lots of other examples that makes it difficult to use and manage the system. So you might have duplicate metadata. So you have two BCG coverage indicators and the users don't know which one to use. You might have bad naming conventions, so no one is really sure what they're looking at means. You might have indicators or program indicators that don't have the right expressions, so they're not actually producing the outputs they're supposed to. Sharing might not be set up, so wrong users see the wrong content. You might have too many super users, so things sort of go out of hand quickly. Even if you clean something up, you might have too many people who are able to change things, so things quickly go. I mean, the same issues reappear. So what are some of the consequences? I mentioned a few things, but I think, again, thinking of it in two ways. One is that you might have stuff that just breaks. You might have analytics jobs that doesn't run because you have some weird configuration issues, some issue with the metadata that the system doesn't expect. You might have calculations that produce the wrong outputs. You might have program rules in your data entry screen that doesn't trigger at the right place. Performance can be affected by metadata issues. So analytics generation is one thing. You might have duplicate categories, for example, meaning that in your analytics generation, in your analytics tables, you actually have a lot more columns, a lot more data than you need because you're not reusing metadata in the right way. The metadata endpoints as well can be slowed down if you have sort of unnecessary metadata that needs to be checked every time you're making changes. So performance can be affected. Many examples where upgrade to a new version doesn't work properly because there might be missing constraints, or you might have unexpected metadata configurations that the system doesn't handle. I think for a system administrator, it might just be complicated to maintain the system if you have sort of excessive amounts of metadata. And I mean, if we're thinking of the typical national HMIS, we see many examples where there are like 5,000-10,000 data elements and indicators. Looking at the visualizations, you might have 30, 40, 50,000 visualizations in the database. So it's just a lot of things to maintain for the administrators. More on the system user side, this kind of metadata issues makes it difficult for users to find what they're looking for. So if you don't have a good naming convention, if you have duplicates, if you don't put the metadata in groups, systems trying to find something they want to visualize, they're not able to find what they need, and they might not be looking at what they think they're looking at. Some of these things also sort of limits what you're able to do with the data. Again, coming back to these kind of category duplications and things, which makes the data within the database incompatible. So if you have one disaggregation called 0 to 11 months, you have another one called less than 1 year. You're not able to put data elements using those two different category options in the same table, for example, in the same chart, in the same column, so to speak. So it limits what you're able to do with the data. Same with group sets. If you don't manage them properly, you're not able to use those ownership, org unit ownership dimensions, org unit type dimensions properly in the analysis tools. I mean, also having this kind of messy metadata with duplications and poor naming makes it difficult to set up integrations with other systems that requires you to map from one system to another. So I mean, all in all, it sort of affects everything we do in different ways, how we manage our metadata. So I tried to put together a few examples here. It's a busy slide with some animations, but one example, this is from an actual HMIS instance. In the data visualizer app, someone wants to look at the BCG immunization, searches for BCG, and it gets a list of maybe 100 data elements, indicators, with all sorts of things, lots of duplications. The same thing, speaking of WHO, here is one duplication coming from the WHO packages, just as WHO enters the room. So I mean, for end user looking for a particular data element, this kind of setup makes it very, very difficult to find what you need. Another example at the top here, organization units not in all compulsory organization unit group sets. This is typically the org unit ownership, org unit type, referral level, those kind of group sets that is set up, letting you do analysis based on, for example, private sector, public sector. So sort of quite core things. But if you have 2,000 organits that are not correctly set up in these groups, that means you're either double counting or you're not including all the data. So if you don't have those group sets properly set up, you can't really use those dimensions at all because you can't trust the outputs. In the middle here, we have this table with the categories. That's an example of a tool that Jason will talk a bit more about. That is listing data element categories that is not used for any analytics. And that's not really a problem per se, except that it's still included in all the analytics generation. It's still including in the database. So if you have 50 of these categories, that's 50 columns in your database for every data value in the system that you don't really need. So it just makes the analytics process take longer. It makes the disk space, it makes the system take up more disk space for no reason. Bottom left, an example of what happens if you don't reuse your category options. So it's maybe a bit difficult to follow the steps there, but it shows how if you have, for example, a population under 1 year set up with one category option, you have another data element for pentavon vaccine, for example, set up with a 0 to 11 months, you're not able to actually put them in the table together and have a table where you have the data elements and you have the age groups, because you're not reusing the category options as you should in this case when it's the same concept. Last example, 2,000, again, coming from a national HMIS, 2,000 data elements, aggregate data elements, not linked to any data values. So that's typically happening when people are using the production instance for development. So they have someone in the ministry comes with a new data set. Can we please set up this? We want to start using it next year. And they go directly into production system and start adding data elements. And by the time next year, January comes, they made a new form or they decided not to include it after all, but the data elements are still there in the production system. And in many cases, sharing is not really used. So those data elements, they show up for every user. Every time a user tries to open Data Visualizer, look for something, they see these data elements meant for a new data set 2 years ago that no one ever started using. So it just makes it difficult for anyone to find what they're looking for because there is so much unused garbage in the system. What we're seeing in many cases when we're working with different country systems is that this is sort of a growing problem over time because there are many countries now that have been using DHIS for 10, 15 years. And this kind of metadata just grows and grows in a way. You have new data sets coming in every year. The ministry changes some reporting forms, so you have some new disaggregations. New programs are coming in. And it just sort of gets added in there, often without a clear plan on how it's going to be maintained. No clear plan of what to do with the data element that was used 10 years ago. That has 2 years of data, but hasn't really been used for a long time. What's the strategy for that? Lots of metadata also in the system linked to specific users. So typically everyone can make their own visualization favorites, their own maps, their own dashboards. But what happens to the user, all the stuff that user created 5 years ago when they left the service, that stuff is typically just sitting around. Because there typically isn't a clear process for what to do with that metadata when the user leaves. And DHIS doesn't really have good tools of managing it for you. So you have to figure out your own solution to that. I already mentioned one of the sources of this, which is that production environments are used in many cases as a sort of a development instance. It's not a good process. And there's often a lack of clear SOPs and coordination around how the metadata is managed, is sort of what we're seeing and hearing. I think what Jason will focus on in a minute around the metadata integrity checks, that has been a problem for many years in DHIS2. They haven't really worked on large implementations for many, many years until, I guess, 2 years ago, 1 year ago. So that hasn't really helped in the cases where you want to kind of monitor your metadata. You haven't really had any tools until recently to do it within DHIS. But the sort of net result is that in many places, this long-running ministry instances is sort of becoming gradually more and more messy in many places. So last year or two, we've been trying to focus more on this. I've tried to sort of organize some of the initiatives we've had around the metadata integrity here into approaches to identify, fix, prevent, and monitor the metadata integrity and quality issues. So in terms of identifying, with DHIS 41, there was actually a new API for metadata integrity that was introduced, which actually works, unlike the previous metadata integrity checks, even on large instances, because it's more modular. You can run one check at a time rather than everything, etc. And in 41, there was a new app introduced that uses this API. We've added some new guidelines on how to sort of do manual reviews, because not everything can be automated here. And as Jason will talk more about, we've also been trying out some different, more custom tools for identifying metadata issues that are not part of the API. In terms of fixing metadata issues, you saw in the What's New presentation today, there are some new functions for merging duplicate metadata. There's still a lot of stuff that you can only really do manually, and we have a bit of a project where we're trying to work with a few countries now on identifying the sort of hardest problems that needs to be solved manually and trying to document those and have some guidelines on how to address the common difficult problems that we're not able to automate. And again, we have also some custom tools that Jason will talk about. For preventing, one thing that is sort of necessary but typically needs to be defined for each implementation is having like a clear SOPs for the system admins for managing the metadata changes, having a clear naming convention so that people know what they're actually supposed to do when it comes to managing the metadata. One thing we'll hear about on Friday in what's next in DHIS is some improvements around the metadata import API that's planned, which will give you more tools when you're importing metadata or in more detailed feedback, which will hopefully make it easier to have a good process where you work separately in a development instance and then move your stuff over to production when it's ready. And finally, Jason will now talk about some tools for monitoring metadata, making it easier to see and track integrity issues over time. So you can actually have a dashboard showing you what kind of issues you have and how things are going, and letting you sort of intervene before things go out of hand. And with that, I'll hand over to Jason.
Maybe I can use this mic while getting the other one on. Okay. Yeah, so I did want to talk about the sort of some more of the technical details. You can still hear me on this mic? Yeah, good. As Olav mentioned, there were a lot of problems with the kind of nuts and bolts of sometimes it's called data integrity. I call it metadata integrity. We probably need to clarify the terminology that we use. There are some aspects of data quality as well, but in general, what we're talking about is metadata integrity. Previously, prior to version 39, all of the checks were Java-based. And while they tended to work quite well on the Sierra Leone database, as soon as you got them on any database of any substantial size, they didn't work, or they were extremely slow. In worst case scenarios, they could bring the whole server down. They were very non-performant, very memory intensive. And we saw it quite often that it could completely destabilize a production instance. So, this was a risk basically of going into the data integrity API and pressing that red button could bring the whole system down basically. So there was a joint effort between the implementation team and the backend development team, the platform team, to completely rewrite this API from the ground up to make it more performant, more stable, and also, importantly, extensible to allow you to write your own integrity checks. Talking about Kale features, this was something that Kale was very insistent that we should do because integrity checks for one instance is not necessarily the same as the others for another instance. Yeah, so in version 40 plus, the integrity checks have been completely rewritten from the ground up. All of the checks now are based on SQL, and we have written all of the SQL queries sort of based on our experience of working with DHIS2 over the past 15 years or so. We've collected many of these types of queries, many problems that we've seen, and trying to distill those down into individual checks that can be run in the system basically. We had a couple of ways of iterations of going through this, but we did finally decide to use a file format called YAML. I'll show you an example of one of these configuration files. And the reason that we did this is that YAML is yet another markup language. It's very similar to JSON, but it's more human readable. And the reason that we wanted to do it this way is that it may be useful for DHIS2 administrators to kind of look at the files, particularly the SQL, and copy that out into their database. If they're working directly with a database, it may be easier to have that SQL handy. So we wanted to make it sort of human readable, but at the same time, we needed a structure that we could read into Java, basically. I also will talk about the extensibility. We won't have a whole lot of time to go into that. It's documented very well, I think, in the documentation, but I did want to also mention that it's possible. In terms of how things are organized now with the new metadata integrity API, there's basically two, let's say, a summary and a detail. The summary will basically tell you how many issues there are. And it will oftentimes try and calculate a percentage. So as an example, you might be looking at organization units with trailing spaces. So you would see, 20 organization units, and you would also see a percentage. And the percentage is just really meant to give you some idea of scale. If you've got 20 out of 20,000, maybe it's not a really big problem. But if you've got 10,000 out of 20,000, the percentage is 50, then it might be a bigger problem. The checks can be triggered individually, either in bulk or, importantly, specifically. That was one of the major problems with the previous implementation, is that it was either all or nothing, basically. You could not run one check individually. So even if you found a particular problem, you were only working on, the organization unit group problem that Olav was mentioning, and you wanted to go back and check and see, have I solved that problem? You had to run everything again, and that process could be very, very intensive. So now you can be selective about what you run. For performance reasons, we cache the results for an hour, basically. This was kind of an arbitrary decision, but it's maybe good enough so that it's just cached in memory. You don't have to continually rerun them. Yeah, slow checks, this is important. I won't talk about the asynchronous stuff. I don't think it's that important, but slow checks we have marked as being they must be run individually. And this is a bit opinionated. All of the checks that we have included from the core side have meant to be run very quickly, meaning that regardless of the scale of the database, they should run within, and let's say on decent hardware, they should run in less than 1 second. And in many cases, they run in only a few milliseconds. So we've basically tried to tune these SQL queries so that they're very quick. But in certain cases, it's unavoidable that some of them are going to be slow, and particularly the ones that touch the data values table, which tends to be a very, very big table. Those types of queries are always going to take time. We have also maintained some of the checks as Java. They have to be run in Java because we could not port them over to SQL, basically. And so those checks we've also considered to be slow, meaning that you have to run them individually as opposed to running them in bulk. This is the metadata integrity UI. I'm going to show you the API in a minute, basically. But this is available in version 41 plus. You may need to update the data administration app as well. It sort of depends on what version of 41 you're using, but if you're using the latest patch version of DHIS2, it should be included, but if not, you can update your data administration app and it will be included. But it's a fairly straightforward UI. You know, we've got the checks here on the left side, indicators with the same formula, program rules with no priority. This gives you the number of problems. If you click on one of those individual checks, basically, then the details are displayed. So that was the two sort of parts of the checks I was talking about. One being the summary and the other being the details. Within the details, we've given a kind of subjective severity level. One of the last discussions I had with Kalle was regarding this, and he was very insistent that some things were warnings, should be errors, should be info only. This ended up being sort of our opinion from the implementation side as to what we felt was importance in terms of severity. Certain things, as Olav mentioned, some of them can really deleteriously affect the system, meaning that if you have this metadata problem, it may cause critical problems within your instance. Whereas warning is like, it may be a problem, but it may not be a problem. And that's where these metadata integrity checks can be kind of gray, right? It's not always sort of black and white issue. There can be situations where you as the administrator may have to decide whether or not this is a problem or isn't a problem. We have also provided some recommendations and explanations. So what is this? I mean, this is a particular indicators not used in any analytical objects. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward, right? Like you've got an indicator, but it's not used in any visualization, map, or pivot table, basically. And then some sort of recommendation, right? Try to describe what should we do about this problem. In this, you know, taking this as an example, it could be maybe you've imported a metadata package and you've got a lot of indicator formulas that you simply don't need, right? It could also be that you have recently created new indicators that you know that you're going to need, but you haven't created the associated visualizations for them, right? So that's why we've created this user interface this way to allow you to sort of triage the issues. You know, is it a real issue or is it not a real issue, basically? Yeah, I mentioned this basically. The only other thing that I will say, I think we've sort of not been totally clear about this, but Some of this some of this functionality is available in version 39, although I think there's only maybe 4 or 5 checks that we backported to that version. Version 40 has most of the checks, but it doesn't have a UI. Version 41 has basically almost all of the checks, and it has a UI. But if you're using version 39 or 40, there is a app, I'll put it in quotes, available in the DHIS2 App Hub. This is not an official app that's produced by the front-end team, but was produced by the implementation team. It's very basic, but it will work. So if you are stuck on that version, or if you're thinking about upgrading, right, you may also want to consider taking a look at that app, because as Olav mentioned, this can cause problems upgrading. So it's probably a good idea to run these new integrity checks, basically, if you're planning on upgrading to 41 or 42, and trying to resolve as many of the problems as you can prior to upgrading. Yeah, let's move on. How am I doing on time? Okay, yeah. I think I'll skip that slide. I'm going to talk very quickly about this because I did want to give you a brief demo. Extensibility through custom checks. Okay. This was a key feature that we worked on with the backend team to allow basically the extensibility of the checks with ones that you create based on your own requirements, things that may not be applicable across DHIS, all DHIS2 systems. I've created a link here in the documentation for details on how to do this. I think this is documented very well. It obviously will require intimate knowledge of SQL and the DHIS2 database. You're going to have to write it basically yourself. But as an example, we've given some examples of how to do this. A simple one might be ensure that all users have valid email addresses. That's not a general requirement, right, for all DHIS2 instances, but it could be. I think even this morning I heard, particularly around the authentication with two-factor email, that you shouldn't have duplicate email addresses, right? So that could be a situation where you first want to onboard all of your users and be sure that everybody has an email address, but then you may have to go one step further and be sure that there are no duplicate email addresses within the system and resolve that. So this gives you a kind of an extensibility point to say, you know, we can create our own custom checks and have those included in the overall integrity checks that are part of every system. Some other more specific ones. I think a lot of this work grew out of work that we had done with PEPFAR, where we created a lot of SQL-based checks that were very similar to what we've implemented now for the core. They had very strict requirements about user roles and groups, that certain roles also had to have certain groups. And so there was a whole like subsystem that was created with SQL checks and Python to produce a report. And a lot of that we sort of funneled back into this work with the core. But that could be another check that you could think about, you know, that you want to have a certain type of users. Like maybe the data entry user should always also belong to certain groups. We've seen that happen very often, right? That maybe certain data elements are not shared with the data entry users. Some people can see them, some people cannot see them. So using this type of approach with the custom data integrity check, you could create a query for that and identify all of those users that don't correspond to that situation. I think that's maybe it for my slides. For the slides in terms of the API itself. Now, so once we sort of finished all of this, and we spent quite a lot of time first creating all of the checks, when we started talking to countries, sort of the initial feedback was, okay, but now what? So great, you've given us this shiny new app and API, and it's like YAML and SQL and all this cool stuff. But what do we do about it, right? How do we solve the problem? And that became sort of the next challenge, really, was that once we had sort of solved the diagnosis, what is the actual medicine to solve the problems? In terms of how to do it, right? I sort of put what we believe is kind of the general way where we've seen and how people have solved these problems in the past. And these are kind of going from lower risk to higher risk. Lowest risk, obviously, is probably using the native DHIS2 user interface. You know, there's been a lot of testing, both manual testing, integration testing, all sorts of testing. There's been a lot of thought put into the native DHIS2 apps. So that could be one way of doing it, right? Some community apps, I think, are also quite useful for these types of things, particularly for operations in bulk. There is the user extended app that allows you to do sort of bulk actions. That's not something that a lot of the DHIS2 native apps allow you to do. I think increasingly there's attention on that. But for instance, fixing all organization units with trailing spaces, that's not like a feature inside the maintenance app, right? There's no way to do that. So you got to go in and click individually one by one. And if you've got 60,000 of them, it becomes very troublesome and problematic to do that. Ad hoc API queries could be one way of doing it, right? You could use, maybe it's not easy to do it through the user interface, but it might be possible through the API. Another method that I've heard people doing, and I'm going to point to Olav here, is export, edit, and upload method, as I call it. And that's basically when you export your metadata, you use search and replace or something like that, and like a text editor, and then you upload everything back again, right? So that's another way. Bespoke tools and apps. That could be another way. If you have a tool, maybe someone has developed that has been tested to some extent, could be one way. Custom API scripts, for instance, a Python, Node.js, R script that you've developed that helps to automate the task, right? And lastly, direct operation on the database with SQL. And I wanted to be clear in terms of what I felt was lowest risk to highest risk, right? SQL queries obviously are probably the most powerful and direct way, but you better know what you're doing because it can be irreversible, particularly if you're, clearly you should never do that on a production system. But in terms of risk, this is, I think, in terms of, various ways that we can solve these problems. Olav and I started looking, I guess, a year or so ago about developing bespoke, what we call tools, right? These are meant to be sort of disposable tools that are intended only for administrators. They're not necessarily intended for end users. But to simplify some of the tasks of solving these metadata issues. As an example, prune, stale, or empty dashboards. We've seen systems where there are tens of thousands of dashboards that haven't been viewed in years, right? So how do you do that? How do you get rid of all of those? It's not so straightforward to do it with the normal dashboard app. Duplicate translations, we've seen this, that if you have a duplicate translation, you can't edit a metadata object. So we created a tool basically to allow you to deduplicate the translations, to say which one of the translations for French, when there are two, is the valid one. And that would then allow you to edit the metadata object, basically. Validating program rule expressions. I'll show a quick example if I have time. Yeah, I'm still got a few minutes here. Removing white space, leading space, multiple spaces in between, trailing spaces. That's not super straightforward to do even with SQL, right? Because you've got indicators, data elements, option sets, you've got all sorts of metadata objects. And so having some way to interact with the API basically might be a better way to do that. Aggregating user roles. This has been a tricky problem over the years because we've seen a lot of instances where people suddenly lose access to being able to edit user roles, which they previously had access to. And this creates, this is because of the security model of DHIS2. Olav mentioned disabling unused category dimensions. I've seen this one in almost every single DHIS2 instance I've ever seen, where people tick the category dimension as an analytical dimension, basically. That creates a column in the analytics tables. But that column then is never, ever used, basically, for anything. So this creates disk wastage. It creates increased CPU. It heats up our planet. So potentially disabling these category dimensions is maybe a good idea, right? Yeah. So these are some of the tools that we've created. The implementation team, have also given a lot of recommendations back to the core team in terms of what we feel like would be potentially a direction that they should go. We're still trying to figure that out, I think, in terms of how much this type of functionality would be part of the core. Some of it, like the merging of category options. Previously, I know Olav spent a lot of time working with certain countries about do that. Now the core team has added that into the core to allow you to merge category options, for instance. So I think increasingly a lot of these, and I'm looking at Marcus here, a lot of these types of features will eventually be kind of absorbed into the core, but it may take time. Yeah, in terms of these tools, I'm just going to mention very quickly, not developed or vetted by the DHIS2 front-end team. Very basic user interface, often developed with LLM assistance, meaning ChatGPT. Capable of performing irreversible operations in bulk, and obviously should be used with extreme levels of caution and tested in a non-development or a non-production environment. Yeah, so that's it. I'm going to switch quickly now over to, and I did want to give Barnabas a few minutes here. Share screen. I'm going to switch over to my laptop here. Yeah, so just really quickly in terms of the, is everything okay? Yeah, okay. You don't see my screen? New share. Yeah, nothing seemed to have. Maybe we come back to it. I'll come back to this at the very end. Maybe we can get to it. Maybe we can switch over to Barnabas now, who will join us from Abuja to talk about some country experience from Nigeria. Hey, Barnabas, are you there? Barnabas?
Yeah, Jason.
Barnabas, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yeah, so maybe while I work out my AV issues, we'll turn it over to you. We got about maybe 5 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. So let me take it over from there. While you try to fix.
Oh,
All
okay.
right. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay. All right. Afternoon, everyone. Morning, depending on where you're connecting from. So my name is Barnabas, and I'll be looking at I'll be doing a reflection of the Nigerian metadata integrity and the recent cleaning exercise that we carried out. So I'm an implementer in DHIS2. We've been doing this for over 10 years in Nigeria. So the outline is very brief. We're looking at just the background of the instance in question. We'll look at the metadata assessment that we carried out and some of the issues that were identified and the resolutions that we used. So we have a database for the country which is called the NHMIS, and that's the official repository of all health data in Nigeria. And it houses about 40,000 health facilities. A few of them are no longer functional, but you know that for DHIS2, they need to still remain on the system because they have data that has been stored on them for some time. So it stores over 13 years of data since the inception of the system. It has about 42,000 users. So we carried out a metadata assessment in Abuja, and we had, as part of the team, the UIO implementation team, represented by Jason and David. We had colleagues from DHIS2 WCA and our team here in Nigeria. And we made use of the metadata integrity app and the custom checks to look at the issues that we have on the system. So we identified issues. There were many, but we had to categorize them based on the level of effort that will be required to fix them. When you have a lot of issues, you don't handle all at once. There are some that might be severe. The app is able to tell you which ones should be, maybe they are more critical, and those that are less critical. And we're able to estimate the effort that will be required to fix, and these are some of the issues that we have highlighted here. For high, we have most issues with our org units. This is as a result of the way that the org units are managed in the country. We'll not go into details of that. We have just 5 minutes, so we'll try to keep to that. So in fixing this, we made use of various approaches depending on the issue at hand. There were some that were easy to manage using the DHIS2 native user interface. For example, you have a few data elements that don't belong to a particular org unit group. You're able to fix them if there are not so many. But for those that were many, there were some that we had to export. There were some metadata that we had to export, edit, and we'll upload back. There were some that we had to use ad hoc API queries, and we used Ada Postman to push the queries to make those changes. We also use some apps that are available. For example, we had several dashboards that were empty and those that were no longer used. For those that were empty, we were able to use the app for pruning empty dashboards. For user issues, for example, we had situations where some users did not even have user groups attached to them. We were able to make use of user extended app to correct that as well. We had issues with duplicate org units where we were able to use the merge API to correct that. In using that, we discovered something funny with the API, but for example, you needed to provide more than one parameter. For the API, you need to provide the source and then the destination. And the source, you needed to provide 2 sources instead of a situation. But if you have only one that is duplicated, you need to just provide the ID for that. But a tweak was for us to, maybe you have to, for the meantime, create a additional duplicate org unit, and then use the ID there, and we're able to solve that. So there are some things that may not have a straight workaround, but you need to still look at how that can be solved. So looking at the next steps, we need to look at how we can prevent, like Jason said earlier, or is it Olaf? You need to see how you can prevent and Some of those prevention strategies are development of SOPs. We're working with the ministry to see how some of those SOPs can be developed. One other key challenge we have is that of the management of health facility listing in the country. The country uses a custom-made platform called the Health Facility Registry. And by policy of the government, changes to org units have to be initiated from that platform. So the DHIS is left with no option but to just receive what comes from that end. At the moment, that platform is not functional, and the ministry is working on seeing that it comes back to being used. And there are some checks that will need to be put there so that we ensure that whatever comes from there does not develop additional problems on the DHIS2. We also are looking at developing custom data integrity checks to help us monitor metadata. Like Jason said, we're exposed to a lot of the custom integrity checks. And like the name implies, custom, you can use the template and you're able to generate what suits your need. And you'll be able to see that come up in the data integrity checks when there are violations. And of course, you can also run schedules to notify you when there are such challenges. So this is just a brief of how we went about our metadata assessment and cleaning in Nigeria. Thank you. Jason, you can take it over from there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barnabas. It was a very interesting week that we spent with Barnabas and his team in Nigeria. We learned a lot. I think it was very successful. What Barnabas didn't tell you, I think, is that how much effort, really, to give you some sort of perspective, is that, you know, solving these problems does take time. And that has often been the challenge, is finding time and funding to solve the problems, right? Because this is like creating technical debt, basically, is that you move on from one project to the next project, but you don't have time to sort of clean up what has been created previously. We're almost out of time, and I did want to leave some time for, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll go 5 minutes. I guess you can see my screen. Coming back to the tools very quickly, I wanted to go quickly over this for some of you in the group that may want to explore the use of these. We have organized these on our GitHub. We have not included these into the app hub because we felt that they were probably either too crappy to put there or too dangerous for normal consumption. And so we've sort of purposefully hidden them on GitHub to make it sort of less visible, since these are only really intended for administrative purposes. But you can go to the DHIS2 GitHub and search for tool, and there are a number of these available. One example, I think, is this like white space remover. And so you can click here on this white space remover tool. They will be distributed as zip files. You can download the latest release, basically. And then go to the app management app. I guess maybe you have to log in again. And then to install these, you just go to app management, and you'll have to install them manually. And so obviously, you know, you should use these types of tools with caution. We've given them all the same icon, just a very generic like tool with a wrench. And again, these are meant to be very simple tools to help you accomplish specific tasks. So you clean all of your white space basically from whatever it may be. Like in this case, we've got multiple, I guess these are options. That's weird. Data elements, for instance, I guess this means multiple spaces, right, Olaf? And so we can check this, and this is needed because in this particular instance, you might create a conflict by resolving. And this is what we've seen in many cases, is that people have purposefully introduced multiple or trailing spaces to distinguish organization units. But this creates a lot of problems because then users don't know which of the organization units, the one without the trailing spaces or the one with the trailing spaces, is the one I should enter data into. Some of these particular problems have been solved in more recent versions of DHIS2. I think the API actually trims now the leading and trailing spaces. It previously didn't do that, right? And so some of these problems you will only see, and this is kind of what has happened, is that in older versions of DHIS, or let's say older instances of DHIS2, we often see more of these types of problems than very recent versions where the API has been sort of tightened up, but you may see a lot of these types of issues in older systems. So yeah, once you find that, you can do fix, and then it should basically just update the data element, trimming out the multiple spaces. Another example is program rule validator. This particular one has to do with invalid program rule actions, I think is how you say it, if I'm correct. But basically, these are program rule actions which do not have a correctly defined expression. So the expression is not valid, basically. It won't work. And what we've seen in practice is that the system kind of swallows this, right? You may see it in the back-end logs, but you may not see it on the front end. You don't know that the problem is happening because what happens on the front end is that you don't see anything. It's just the action doesn't execute, basically. And so you may think something is happening, but actually nothing is happening because the front end has kind of suppressed this problem. So this is, again, another example of one of these tools to help you to identify these invalid program rule actions and then go to the maintenance app and see what the problem is. So this is in program rule actions. Was it the program rule expression or here maybe? Okay. So even there, we've got a problem with the front end, right? Cannot read properties of undefined reading text. So even in the front end app, we can't necessarily even change this. So we might have to even go to, using something like Postman to actually correct the problem. But at the very least, this tool might help you to identify. So again, if you want to find these tools, we've created a link on the inside the presentation. You can search for them. But again, I will say these are caveat emptor. Use them at your own risk and do not use them necessarily in a production environment. I think that's all that we had. We're at 1 minute over, but it's a coffee break. So I think we can take some time for questions if you have them. Barnabas, I think, is still on the line if anybody has questions for him. Yep.
So just to say, Jason, that was a great screen to end on, because we have now, as you heard in the session this morning, we have now consolidated the rule engine. So the same engine is being used in the front end and in the back end and on Android. And this kind of problems are the very problems that you now will see that the JavaScript might have swallowed before, now that we're running a proper engine everywhere. So this tool might be a great one for anyone upgrading now as well.
Yeah, we've seen that in instance 41 that's trying to upgrade to 42, but I think you can switch, right? You can, in 41, you can selectively use the new program rule engine, right? And that's exactly what we've done there, is to selectively enable it to to be sure to enable them to fix all of these issues, basically. But finding the issue was not super straightforward because there's no integrity check to do that, basically, right? So the only way was this special tool. But yeah, no, this is great because I think we even saw in this particular instance, you might not see an issue on the back end, but you would see it on the front end or vice versa, right? That it might work on the front end, but it didn't work on the back end or the other way around. So as Marcus pointed out, now that we have a single rule engine that creates both a Java artifact as well as a JavaScript artifact, then we know that the logic is basically the same in theory, right? We'll put it to the test. Any questions? Yeah.
So I don't know if we hear me. Yeah. Okay, right.
So thank you for the presentation. I'm Frank from MSF Geneva. I'm very excited about all this. I'm hoping that we can clean our system. I've just do a quick check, and we have like 7,000 visualizations that have not been checked in the last 12 months. It's quite interesting, but in our case, in MSF Geneva, we have 50 servers in 50 missions around the world that are synced with the global server. I think is the case of other sections of MSF and maybe other organizations. So I don't know this kind of rules that checks the use of the metadata you have, how it's stored in database, and it's a way of syncing that to the global, or we have to run that 50 times and consolidate somehow in to get the truth. No, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have checks for that, right, Olav? Like, well, I mean, you pointed it out. Is have the visualizations been viewed in the past year? I mean, I don't know how you're doing the syncing with all of those 50 downstream servers, but just with
Metadata sync.
the metadata sync, yeah.
I think because the usage here is using the data statistics API, and I don't think that won't be synced with the metadata sync. So you won't know in the central instance. I mean, what you have in terms of analytics views in the country, or
I think long story short, you could do it, right? But you wouldn't be able to do it necessarily with the core feature. I didn't have time to go through the API, but all of this is exposed to the API. So you could certainly think about maybe creating a script to selectively maybe, not sync these. But I think there's really no option to do that right now, right? It could be. And you want to push them down. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the constant tension, right? Is how much of this should be as a core feature as opposed to an extensibility, something that you can build that's very specific to your setup. What's behind all the user interface is an API. So you would certainly be able to say, how often has this visualization been viewed? That's one thing that you can get from the usage statistics API. You could also sort of get, the unused visualizations. And maybe between those two, you could figure out what do we need to push down and what do we need to pull up. But we don't have any plans, I think, at this point to include something like that. But, I think we've tried to give people a kind of an extensibility endpoint to say, if you have that type of feature, it might be something that you have to build yourself. Maybe one more question, and yeah, Bob, I'll defer to our senior, our wise one.
That's been snarky. First of all, I think everything that you presented, all the stuff that you've done, is great. Long overdue. I can see it hugely valuable. We still are faced with the problem that our metadata is just like a big dark cave. We know there are demons in it. Oh, you've created this fleet of secret submarines that can go down and find problems
Mm.
and sometimes even go and fix them, but that's a bit dangerous.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, we still have this big black hole of stuff that now we hope is a better one than before. I think what is missing, and maybe it's the next step, is a better way to publish and visualize our metadata. But at the moment, it's very hard to look at your metadata without taking a huge clicking tour through the maintenance app, for example.
Yep.
Maybe this is a plug for Johan's next section, because he's going to talk about publishing the metadata for tracker programs. And one of the first things we found when we did that wasn't using Fire, but it wasn't so much that Fire was such a cool thing. But
It was just
the
suddenly publishing.
you can see it all, and you can see the relations.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, thank you, Bob. You know, Marcus is in the room. I think, you know, we could always think about, I completely agree that, you know, particularly if you look at an instance like the size of Nigeria that's been there for the past more than 10 years, you know, the metadata becomes an oubliette. It's just this like very deep, dark, impenetrable kind of mass that is very difficult to get your head around. Yeah, we've tried to identify some of the problems. Olav has also, I think, started to think a little bit about potentially how we can use things like artificial intelligence. We saw one this morning to make more sense of the metadata. You know, where do we actually have semantic duplicates? That's not something that you can do at all with an SQL query. But increasingly, there may be ways that we can leverage AI maybe to make more sense of these types of problems. Yeah, I think we're out of time.
Yeah, just to say there is a feedback thing here, if you have feedback. Also on Thursday, in these expert lounges, we have a setup for anyone who wants to talk about these integrity checks or these tools or other metadata related things with Jason and myself. I think you have a session tomorrow on how you can also monitor this metadata integrity checks over time. So set up a dashboard showing you the results of these checks, which I think we can also discuss more in this expert lounge on Thursday if you're interested in trying to set that up.
Yep.
And of course, we're always happy to talk about metadata if you want to.
We'll be around all week. So if you have questions or ideas, you know, as I mentioned, we developed some of these apps, tools very quickly. They're very basic, vanilla HTML and JavaScript. So if you have ideas, specific problems, I think Olav and I would be very interested to hear. We provided a lot of feedback to Marcus and his team, I think, as well, for things that they can think about going forward to include it into the core. If you have ideas about specific integrity checks, once you've had a check or a chance to look at them, and if you're missing something, let us know. You know, either create a JIRA ticket or find us this week. And normally writing SQL is straightforward. The Java normally takes a lot longer to create, but we can get it done. Because a lot of this is based on personal experience. Kale was, coming back to him, was we were talking about these checks just 2 days before he passed away. And he was an immense source of wisdom about what works and what doesn't work. And I think we have a lot of that knowledge out in the community. So if you've seen certain things that you believe probably should be included as a integrity check, let us know, and we can share that more broadly with the community. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and yeah, have a nice conference. Thank you, Barnabas.